It's Codex Beats.
Bang, bang. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Teach Yourself Foreign Policy. And today is week 7. We're going to be discussing World Trade Organization, WTO, World Trade Organization. World Trade Organization is one of the institutions that operates globally. That's an intergovernmental institution, and viewers will get these objectives that we'll learn what are the aims of WTO, that's World Trade Organizations. We'll attend to the differences between rule-governed trade and versus free trade. Then you look at the structure of World Trade Organization, WTO, get to know about the obligations of WTO in terms of bound tariffs, most favored nations, national treatment. Then you look at compliance. Why should nations comply? What are the two reasons? One could be plain cheating, and one could be trying to protect political national interest. Then you look at enforcement. We look at enforcement. Then we look at, you familiarize yourself with the advantages of WTO. Then we'll also look at sort of the weaknesses of WTO, and then what is likely to happen in future. We could predict based on this. All right. So the name is H. Kwame Afago. Today is mid-month of August 2024. That's 15th of August 2024, and let's keep rolling. What is the aim of WTO? Simply, World Trade Organization is the world trading organization. It means that all trade that happens in the world, that's the economics of it. Imports and exports must meet certain criteria, and the most important criteria is it must not be discriminatory in terms of tariffs or taxes, in terms of what quotas, and then in terms of what subsidies. These three are one of those that WTO seeks to achieve, that there should be rule-governed trade globally, rule-governed trade between states, between territories. All right, let me put it this way. WTO is not necessarily focusing on states, but it is focusing on governments and territories. Okay, so it has about 157 members, with China, Hong Kong, and Taipei. They are not member states or member territories of WTO. However, they participate in WTO activities. Say, European Union is also a member. It participates in WTO activities, though it is not a country per se. It's a territory. That's why European Union is. The other bit is that World Trade Organization emerged in 1995, the year 1995. Meanwhile, the rules that governs World Trade Organization, because it's rule-governed trade. The rule-governed trade to ensure there's no discrimination between nations in terms of their inter-trade dealings is what? General Agreement of Trade and Tariff, GATT. General Agreement of Trade and Tariff. That has outlived the body itself, WTO. GATT was initiated in 1947. Way back in 1947. So those are the aims of that's the primarily that's the aim of WTO. Okay, look at the structure. WTO on the screen as you see, or on your screen as you see, WTO at the top of it, at the pinnacle, you find the Conference of Ministers of Trade. Various territories have their ministers of trade. That's where the decisions, or that's the apex of it. Then it goes to the General Council. It takes a step down to General Council. Then on the left, on the right hand side, you find the Dispute Settlement Board, or the Dispute Settlement Bureau. Then you have the negotiations end. That's the trade policy end of it, also at another arm. Then below the General Council, we have GATT, we have trade policies, we have GATT, we have TRIPS. That's Trade Agreement in Intellectual Property Rights. Then we have GTS, General Agreement on GATS, General Agreement on Trade and Services. General Agreement on Trade and Services. Okay. Then we have what we call procurement, government procurement, also as another arm. All right, with all this, it makes it very simple if you look at the organogram of WTO. So let's go into what WTO does and how the dynamics are understood, so that there will be a much better appreciation of what economics from trading perspective for all countries to know what is happening, or for all viewers to know what's happened, what has happened before, what's happening, and what is likely to happen into the future when it comes to trading, because trading has no specific words of language, but it does carry a certain focus. And every country or every government or every territory wants to be self-centered when it's trading. It wants to benefit from the other. However, WTO says, GATT regulations says no. You don't have to think of benefiting from another and letting another nation or territory lose. It should be fair, or it should be equal treatment, non-discriminatory treatment across board in terms of imports and exports. So it does limit government sovereignty. WTO limits government sovereignty, and that's one of the weaknesses. It limits government sovereignty big time, in the sense that, look, when governments are writing their internal trade policies or trade regulations, when they are dealing such that when they write their internal trade policies in dealing with the external bodies, they have to modify it to suit WTO regulations, which is the GATT regulations. And so it limits nations, their sovereignty, big time. Okay, that's just one bit of it. The other bit is that, look, when it comes to, okay, so now we've done with the structures. Let's go to obligations. When we look at obligations, you see, GATT has a set of rules. GATT rules are quite simplistic, but a bit more legal, in the sense that it carries legal interpretations. It takes lawyers to interpret it better, especially when it comes to dispute resolution. That's why the lawyers' rules are very important. Not necessarily ministerial rules, but what the law in GATT says. And so GATT regulation VI, that is 6, discourages dumping of goods in another country. Dumping means that when you're exporting items to another country, it is incumbent on the exporting country and then the recipient country to ensure, the territories, to ensure that the price that the item goes for in the sending country or the exporting country must not be far higher than the recipient country, that's the importing country price, must not be too high, too high, such that it will mean that it will encourage more goods to be dropped into the recipient country and rendering them at risk at a weak end to damage their economy or to damage their sectors. That's dumping. Okay, so the GATT regulation abhors dumping. It states it clear, it abhors dumping. It also has some exemptions, but before then, let's look at what it forbids quotas, setting quota on imports and exports. For an instance, European Union sometime in the early 2000s placed a quota on bananas from African, Caribbean, Pacific countries. It placed a certain quota, a certain quantity of bananas from African, Caribbean, Pacific countries to enter European Union, and that was contested. And that contest, when it was contested, they had to what? Remove that quota aspect, because it's against GATT regulations. That's the WTO regulations. It was against it. So it's, as the regulation states, it's so clear. Article XI, Article 11 states that it should forbid quotas. Then at the same time, subsidies, XVI, that is 16. It also states subsidies must be what? Discouraged as much as possible. Some countries decide to subsidize their goods so that it will make it more competitive, to make their home country goods cheaper, and their citizens will buy it, and it will discourage them from buying the foreign products. That is pure discriminatory, and it's not right for, it is not proper, rather it is not proper under World Trade Organization. Let's take a break and back.
It's Codex Beats.
Bang, bang.
Yeah, welcome again to the second segment. After the advert, we have this other continuation. We are looking at the obligations of the WTO. One, under the obligations, we have to know one is what? The bound tariffs. The bound tariffs. Tariff is tax. Okay, so the bound tariffs. The bound tariffs, and then we have the most favored states, and then national treatment. Okay, so let's go through carefully and understand what it is. The word bound means walking slow, step. So then it means that all member territories must publish their import duties of every item, categorize it as it's done, especially if you go through, you find that of the USA that has got a harmonized tariff system. They put items in a certain category, and then once that is published, it's online for everyone to know. So every firm, every country that's importing from another country, especially from the US, knows the tariff, the taxes that it will attract at the port. So customs officers are also aware of what tariffs are. They know what should be charged. They can't go overboard or underboard. Then the second bit of this same bound tariff is that after publication, all member territories have to ensure that they do not charge a tariff above the maximum limit set by WTO. There's a cap. WTO sets a cap on the tariff on items. They have categorized it in every items, chandlers and all that stuff, and that for importations and exports. So they have put a cap. It shouldn't go above that. 99% of developed nations have almost gotten to the maximum limit. That's a cap. Meanwhile, developing nations have only 75% in terms of tariff. They've gone as high as 75% to the max of the tariffs. So it means that developing countries are not slightly, about 20% or a little more under taxing themselves when items are going out or they are coming in, especially when they are coming into their country. So it means that they are losing. How can they catch up? It's another issue, because if they lift it up to the advanced level status, the prices of the same goods and services will be too expensive for them to consume. So they're also being careful. All right, so that's just a bit of it. All right, so that is the publications, that, and then the cap on the tariff. That's what bounded tariff. But every nation should publish its import duties online. It must be accessible, whether it's online or any other form. It must be accessible. It must be published. And that's what WTO is saying. The other aspect is that most favored nations, and the obligations is an obligation. Okay, every rule, every regulation, WTO regulations or GATT regulations has obligations, compliance, and enforcement. So we are at obligations now. We are on obligations now. Obligations, we've just dealt with bounded tariff. Then we look at most favored nations. With most favored nations, this bilateral agreement between territories, is not permitted, in a sense that it could create a certain favorable tax regime or quota system or subsidy for one nation against the rest. So if, say, Ghana wants to import items from Togo, it should not enter a certain bilateral agreement with Togo such that it will reduce the tariffs for Togo. Meanwhile, the same items, when it's coming from Europe or from Americas or from Asia, is high up. No, that's discriminatory, and that is what WTO avoids. So WTO, it's a rule-governed trade. It abhors discrimination. It says make the rule universal, equal to all member territories. That's what WTO is all about. Okay. So that notwithstanding, most favored nations don't create a favorable condition, even in terms of inspection of the goods for some countries, and then not for some countries. You make it too rigid for some countries and less rigid for some countries, even in inspection, besides the tariffs on the taxes. That's also not proper. So most favored nations should stop. Once there's a tariff, it should be flat for all on the item, for all nations or territories that are whose goods are entering another territory, especially if it's a member member state or member territory of WTO. Okay, that's notwithstanding, we would have to be mindful of what happens between member territories and non-member territories. For an instance, the US has a tariff of about 40% for all member states when they're importing from member states, but it has 65% tariff for all non-member states if they are importing into the US. Their tariff is so higher for non-member states. The interesting bit is that US has gone ahead to establish free trade agreement with some member states. So we'll look at the difference between what rule governed trade, that's by WTO, and free trade agreement, FTA. We'll look at that after we look at the obligations, compliance, and then enforcement. We'll look at that as well. We should have done that earlier, but I needed to explain these concepts a bit better so that when we get to that bit, it can be well understood. Okay, so that favoritism must not be allowed. It must be abhorred in tariffs, in inspections, in sales tax, and all that. Don't. Then we go from that most favored state. Let there not be any discrimination in imports or exports. The tariffs must be the same for all, whether it's a favored country, a neighbor or not. No. However, there's one bit here. However, WTO has an exemption here. The exemption here is that it respects free trade among regional blocs. For an instance, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, between Canada, Mexico, and the US. There's free trade between them. They just import and export at no tariff between them. If you come to ECOWAS, we move the items within ourselves. Some of them for free, tariff free. Meanwhile, that should have attracted some tariff. So WTO respects that tariff-free regime. Okay, the same way European Union, you can move goods from one European Union member country to another, and that's also tax-free. And that is also respected by WTO. However, generally, no, because that's a regional bloc agreement, and so once regional blocs have taken that decision, WTO and the GATT has to respect it as part of its concept. So it makes the rule governed aspect of WTO a bit weaker because it's now accepting free trade agreements within it. So it is having a two-phase kind of concept. That's WTO is having a two-phase kind of concept. All right, we'll see how it evolves when we get to the weakness. Okay, so that is the all right. So that is the most favored nations, and when we do that under free trade, it becomes problematic, sort of, for those countries that are not having bilateral agreement with other countries that they can import and be given a tariff-free regime, that's free tax regime. It's problematic because it tends to be competitive. The WTO says what? It must be rule governed, it's not free trade, but then it respects free trade within regional blocks. It's not complex, it's not self-defeatist, but it's just a weakness. Okay, then now let's go to national treatment. National treatment is where, as an obligation, GATT is saying that General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, GATT is stating that carefully. GATT is stating clearly that countries shouldn't adapt, say, subsidies or conducive tax regimes or policies, quota systems, to favor their locally produced products against the imported ones. So the tax slapped on imported goods in a territory must be the same as the tax slapped on the locally produced items. That's what it means. Okay, so that notwithstanding, it means that no nation should try to encourage its internal production by giving it subsidy, meanwhile lifting high the tax of the same item that is imported. But then there's a weakness here. That's agric. However, under WTO, agric has its separate rules. Agric has its separate rules where subsidies are implemented. It's weak. The rules there are weak. But we'll get to it when we get to the weaknesses. All right. So that is the bit on national treatment. And nations shouldn't be seen to be placing subsidies, promotional items to make their tariffs reductions, to make their local produce cheaper to imported ones. If that happens, consumers don't have the option of what varieties enough, because the imported ones become so expensive and out of reach of the local consumers. Okay, so it kills innovation and competitiveness. If that happens, it kills competition, which is not right. That's not what WTO is standing for. For an instance, Nigeria in 2003 decided to place some sort of ban on textiles, not just wax prints, textiles generally, import. So then if you want to send textiles to Nigeria 2003, there was a sort of ban, and Benin and European Union took them on that no, they would have to report them to WTO where they are members, and Nigeria had to relook at that again and then remove that conditionality. Then that of the rice, Nigeria closes borders to Benin and some of the land borders to neighboring countries because of rice. They wanted to boost their rice production and rice consumption, their local rice, instead of the importation, because the imported ones were playing a cheaper role than their local produce, so they didn't want that, so they closed the borders to prevent that to happen. That also was a threat. See, when there's this non-compliance, it becomes problematic for member countries and the whole WTO at large. If you want to put in a subsidy on your items, you do not do it to one country bilaterally, but you discuss it at the WTO conference. The General Council will hear it and it will be discussed. If it's accepted by all member countries or majority member countries, then the policy is changed at the policy end to implement that there's this subsidy for Nigeria imports or exports. That's much better done. But bilateral agreement for such subsidies are not permitted. So that's the other bit of national interest. USA, for an instance, had a problem with Japan. National treatment. USA wanted to boost their automobile industry because Japanese auto was big time in US market. So the Michigans and co, the 3 states of Michigan and others, were struggling with American produced automobile. So they decided to put some kind of subsidies and some kind of regulations to weaken the imported Japanese vehicles, but that was also threatened. And when it went to WTO, USA had to withdraw and apologize and then do the needful. Okay, so that takes us to compliance. That's national treatment. So it takes us to compliance. With compliance, let's take a break, and then when we are back, we'll continue, please. And then watch the adverts and take note and participate. Yeah, welcome back to the session on WTO, World Trade Organization. That's this foreign policy. That's week 7, and this is week 7, and so the date is the 15th of August 2024. All right, we are entering compliance. With compliance, the regulations are quite clear, but it needs a lot of legal interpretation. So every territory must have their lawyers to interpret it when they are entering international trade, because this whole issue of economics, no country, no nation or territory is an island. So then we interact, we're dealing with each other. That notwithstanding, we have to know the rules that governs it and how you have to adhere to the rules. Adherence to the rules is what we call compliance. The reason why some countries, you would have thought that rules, once they accepted the treaty, the GATT treaty in 1947, all the way up to now, some countries have not even accepted it, like Ethiopia is not a member of the WTO because they've not accepted the GATT treaty. But a lot of countries have. You would begin to wonder, why would some nations have accepted the treaty yet do not comply? They may have some reasons which we'll have to fly into. One is what? Plain cheating. What we call cheating means that they want to give subsidies to their own produce or to other nations without considering the other members of the WTO, which is not right. So that's cheating. Okay, then the other reason, the only two reasons, most probably, maybe, the other reason is that some nations or some territories think that they have political important good or service that they want to hold on to. If they want to hold on to, then it means that they would have to discriminate against all others. That's also not proper. For instance, the rice business in the rice production trade in Nigeria. Nigeria has its own kind of rice, but it wants every Nigerian to consume that, and so they decided to place some kind of border closure to restrict importation of foreign rice into Nigeria. Though a lot of Nigerians were happy about it, it was against the rule. It was against compliance of WTO and GATT regulations. So then that had to be changed. Okay, so then that's compliance. If a nation does not comply with a treaty or a protocol or a rule or a regulation that it has agreed on and signed to by itself as an intergovernmental organization, then there must be enforcement. Don't forget, the WTO deals with territories. However, territories have private entities that do the trading. So once there's an enforcement and compliance, the territory governance or government must ensure that the private sector complies. If it doesn't comply, the enforcement end of the WTO comes into play. What's the enforcement end? If there is a difference, for instance, dumping. If dumping occurs and it doesn't affect the recipient country, then it's not a problem. But if it harms the recipient country, that word harm has to be interpreted by lawyers. How it harmed the economy, it has to be interpreted by lawyers. And when it's interpreted and reported to the WTO, this is what it is. If you don't report it to the WTO, there's nothing wrong. If you report it to the WTO, then that's what the problem is. That's where it starts. That, okay, there's a grievance. There is a dispute to be resolved between one territory has abused the other territory, has neglected or deliberately flouted the regulation. For instance, the shrimp turtle case, where USA received some turtle and shrimps from some countries based on the net sizes they use, and others it says no, that's most favored nation. So then USA was taken on. WTO enforced that USA had to retract that policy, withdraw it or cancel it, and they did cancel it, and they had to pay compensation. Okay, so WTO in resolving it has what we call the dispute conflict resolution or the dispute settlement board or the dispute settlement bureau. The first thing they do is that once the complaint comes to the WTO, it hands it to a 3-member legal team who are well versed in trade, international trade, to look at. That's the panel, the conflict resolution or dispute settlement panel. They look at it and then they try to encourage the territories, the feuding territories, to resolve that difference. They explain to them using the legalities involved, the legalities of the laws. So if you are not legal in it, don't go close to them when it comes to things like this. I'm not a legal person, so I'll get closer to them as well. But then you would have to let them do their work. Then once they see that there's an infraction, they would request for that infraction to be reversed. So policy must change for that nation that abused the order. Then there must be compensation paid. Okay, we look at it carefully. If not, if the abusing country or the rule-breaking country or the regulation-breaking country, non-compliant territory, decides to fleece, instead of to flex its muscles, to say no, they don't respect the rule of the 3-member panel of the WTO, then this case would have to go to an appellate body, which they also have. The WTO has the appellate body. The appellate body has the appeal. They appeal it and then they also look at it. When that is done and they say no, it will then go to the dispute settlement bureau. And over there, once that decision is taken, a ruling in a court kind of ruling is done there. It tends to take time, though, about a year before the ruling will come. Once that ruling comes, it becomes a bit more painful in the sense that they spell out the sanctions. They give commensurate punishment to the abusing territory. For an instance, we have European Union refusing meat from the United States and then Canada. European Union have refused to accept meat from Canada and USA, America, because it is genetically modified. And this case went to them, but European Union won. And then once they won at WTO, now it's now time for USA and Canada to go through the process. And they have to change their... What was done was that they did not wait for the year for the Dispute Settlement Bureau, DSB, to spell out the punishments. They quickly changed their policy and stopped sending GMO products to meat to European Union. Or not, they know that it will come with a commensurate punishment, sanctions that will be commensurate from all other members, and that could be harmful to the US economy and any other economy for that matter. So the Nigeria case, if it was taken to DSB, it would have been very bad for Nigeria. It would have been very bad, especially now that Nigeria itself is experiencing food crisis. Their rice production didn't meet their consumption. It would have been very bad for Nigeria. Very, very bad for Nigeria. So countries that are thinking they want to be self-sufficient, yes, it's good to be self-sufficient, but do not prevent imported products while you have signed on to WTO. Okay, so that's enforcement. Enforcement in that sense can be very, very disturbing, especially when they carry it out at the time that the government is going into a push, into elections, like Ghana is going to the polls, USA is going to the polls. It will tend to unsettle the government, and the government will be changed. So you don't allow yourself or your territory to go through such practice or such punitive measures from the Dispute Settlement Bureau, the DSB of WTO. Okay, so now we've gone to enforcement. Let's look at the strengths and the weakness. But before then, let's look at rule-governed trade and then free trade. Rule-governed trade is what we have been discussing. There are rules that govern it. It didn't say it's free, that you have to pay tariffs. But the tariffs has defined tariffs that is globally known and globally accepted by WTO, spelled out by WTO and accepted by all member territories. Okay, free trade is where imports and exports among bilateral countries attracts zero tax, no tax at all. Moving items from Belgium to Holland is tax-free. Moving items from Canada to US, tax-free. USA to Canada to Mexico is tax-free. Okay, that is the free trade agreement. So, for instance, Jordan and USA and Israel. Okay, USA and Israel, USA and Jordan have a tax-free, a free trade agreement. Meanwhile, USA and Jordan and Israel are members of WTO. This is where the issue becomes contextual. Until it's reported, it's not a problem. It's a problem that you can contain. Jordan in the year 2000, signed to join WTO. Jordan in the Middle East. Then in 2001, Jordan in the Middle East decided to sign a free trade agreement, FTA, free trade agreement, no tariff, 0 with USA. Then you ask, how can you do the two at the same time? And that's one of the weaknesses of WTO. It is that which is going to pull it down, because a lot of agreements between Australia and other member countries are there. Lots. Australia and other member countries are happening. Australia, India, Singapore, free trade agreements are happening. So it means it's weakening. It's all these countries are members of WTO. It means that they have set the WTO rule, that's the GATT rule, and they are undermining the rule themselves. So it's a weakness, and that will send the world most likely into the future by removing tariffs completely, to be a tariff-free world for imports and exports in the world. So countries must brace up for some of this knowledge. Okay, but WTO has helped the world so much in terms of trade. Without WTO, there will not be abundance of food and goods and services in most countries. Most countries cannot produce everything that they consume, so you needed to import. But without WTO, the trade and the sufficiency or the abundance of the items on your market will not have been seen. What we see now didn't used to be what it was in the 70s. There were shortages in the 70s. in the 1970s, but now in 2024, we have surplus, and China is producing a lot more competitively onto our markets. Okay, so that's courtesy of WTO. Right, WTO has introduced kind of a rule-governed trade or rule-governed economics, international economics that is rule-governed, and that is very helpful. It has brought some sanity in terms of the tariffs into trade, and then it makes sure that you do not abuse like dumping. So WTO is done so well. It's very good. It's got all these advantages. It has assisted in liberalization, then globalization, then it has its dispute resolution. So that's also one good thing about it. The weaknesses, those are the advantages. The weaknesses is what I've mentioned, that it can, the way we are signing free trade agreements, or the way territories have signed the WTO agreement, that's a GATT agreement, and sign on to WTO as members, and at the same time go to sign bilateral agreement, which WTO and GATT is against bilateral agreement with other member countries, is self-worth undermining WTO. So it's possible that the more countries go into free trade agreements, the weaker WTO becomes, and the weaker WTO becomes, with time, it will fold up, unfortunately. As to whether it is good or bad, that's not the essence of the study. How effective is it? What are the benefits? What are the weaknesses? That's what this study is all about. The name is H. Kwame Afaglo. If you have any query or question, don't forget to watch on the screen, send it to the YouTube or the emails, Facebook, social media generally, and we'll be there to respond. Thank you.